Hello everyone, Professor Kurzluck here. So I wanted to make us a video about states, nations, and why they matter in comparative politics. So when we study comparative politics, the most common unit of analysis is the state. In political science, the state is something we spend a lot of time thinking about and studying. And as we work our way through the semester, we'll keep coming back to this idea of the state. That's not because states are the only political actors that matter, but because they remain the primary holders of political authority in the modern world, in the modern global system. We pay taxes to states, obey states' laws, rely on states for security, and cross their borders with passports. Even so, the idea of the state can be surprisingly easy or at times difficult to define. So that's really what this chapter earlier in our semester, early in the reading, is laying out. What is the state? So at its core, at its most basic and simple level, state is a legal and political authority over a defined territory and population. Remember, we can look at a map, we can see borders, we can see lines on a map that are these defined territories and population, of course. Recognized, importantly, both by its citizens and other states. So a state is recognized by its own citizens as well as other states. What makes states distinctive is not just that they govern, but that they claim ultimate authority within their own borders. So, a useful starting point is the classic definition that our textbook, that other textbooks that political scientists utilize, is by Max Weber, who described a state as the entity that successfully claims a monopoly on the legitimate use of force within a territory. That definition highlights two crucial ideas: force and legitimacy. States can coerce, but coercion alone is not enough. For a state to function effectively, most people must accept its authority as rightful. So modern political science usually breaks down the state into 5 defining elements. First, a state has a government, the institutions and officials who exercise authority. Second, it has a population, without which territory would simply be land. Third, it controls a defined territory marked by borders. Again, we can look at it on a map. We started class out looking at a blank, empty map. We know where the border of the US is. We know where the border of Russia is. Fourth, it possesses sovereignty, meaning it is not subject to higher authority within its domain. We know here that there's some contention and discussion about our states changing. Definitely something we'll talk about, and it's worth thinking about how or if state authority may be withering away, or if there's a resurgence in state authority. Finally, the state has legitimacy. It has legitimacy, meaning its authority is broadly accepted by citizens and other states. So it is important to distinguish between a state and a government. Governments come and go. States tend to endure and last. A change in leadership, regime, or ruling party usually does not mean the state itself disappears. This distinction helps explain why revolutions, coups, or elections can radically change politics without eliminating the state as a political entity. The concept of sovereignty is especially central as well. Sovereignty refers to the ability of a political authority to make and enforce decisions without being overridden by an external or internal challengers. Historically, sovereignty emerged in Europe as monarchs consolidated power against feudal elites and religious authorities. Over time, sovereignty shifted from kings to representative institutions, and in democracies, to the people themselves. However, sovereignty is not always absolute. In federal systems, authority is shared between central and regional power. Think of when we take American politics courses, we spend a lot of time thinking about federalism. In today's globalized world, states also pool sovereignty through international organizations and treaty. If you follow the news, you hear a lot about NATO or the UN or the European Union. These supranational organizations can sometimes seemingly eat away at a country's sovereignty, and that's politically contentious. So this does not mean that sovereignty disappears, but it does mean it is oftentimes constrained and negotiated rather than absolute. So closely related to sovereignty is legitimacy. A state is legitimate when its authority is recognized as appropriate and justified. Legitimacy is not just about legality. Laws can exist without being legitimate, or laws can exist without legitimacy, I guess. Instead, legitimacy rests on acceptance. States with deep internal divisions, weak institutions, or contested borders often struggle with legitimacy, which can undermine stability. So when we think about weak states or failing states, this is a concern that arises. So states do many things beyond coercion. They provide security, manage economies, regulate trade, collect taxes, define citizenship, who gets to be a citizen, what that looks like, and provide welfare, provide public services. These functions vary widely across countries, but the underlying authority that enables them comes from the state itself. So, to understand why states look the way they do today, we need to briefly consider their historical evolution. The modern state emerged primarily in Europe between the 16th and 18th centuries. War played a decisive role in this process. As rulers fought wars, they needed standing armies, taxation systems, bureaucracies to manage all of that, and centralized administration again to manage that. Over time, war made the state, and the state made war. A key milestone in this evolution was the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which helped establish the idea that states are sovereign within fixed territorial boundaries. This Westphalian system became the foundation of the modern international order, even as it spread beyond Europe through imperialism and colonialism. The global map of states expanded dramatically in the 20th century. Decolonization after World War II produced dozens of new states, many of which inherited borders drawn by imperial powers rather than by local communities. This created lasting challenges, including internal conflict, weak institution, and contested legitimacy in many post-colonial states. More contemporary, when we think of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, we saw the reemergence of 15 independent states. So even today, you might turn on the news and hear a discussion about parts of a state trying to break away and form their own state. So this isn't just a historical phenomenon that has occurred in the past and that we've moved away from. And as a result, states today differ enormously from one another. One key difference, one major, is that we can easily see is population size. Governing very large states like India, China, or the United States, we know and we can imagine presents challenges that small states simply may not or do not face. Size affects diversity, administrative capacity, and policy coordination. Another key difference, which maybe might seem more important than the size, is wealth. States, as we can imagine and we know, states vary widely in economic development, which shapes their political capacity, their global influence. Wealthier states tend to have stronger institutions, greater state capacity, and more extensive public services, while poorer states often struggle to meet basic needs of its citizens. So, a third dimension of this diversity of states is political authority. Some states exert effective control over their territory and population, while others struggle. This gives rise to categories like quasi states, which are legally recognized but weak in practice, and de facto states, which exercise control without external or international recognition. These cases highlight that statehood is not simply a yes or no binary condition, but a spectrum that maybe we don't spend a lot of time thinking about. No discussion of states, though, is complete without addressing nations and nationalism. A nation is not the same thing as a state, even though at times, in passing, we might use them interchangeably. Even in my lectures, sometimes when I'm just chatting with students, I might use nation, country, and state interchangeably. But when we're thinking about political science itself, there is a distinction between a state and a nation. A nation is not the same thing as a state. We have to remember that. Nations are cultural and historical communities, groups of people who identify with one another based on a shared language, a shared history, maybe a shared cultural experience, or shared myths about their origins. States are legal and political entities, very different. So if nations are historical communities, states are legal and political entities. Sometimes nations and states overlap neatly, creating a nation state. More often, though, they do not overlap. Many states are multinational, containing multiple national groups under one government. In other cases, nations exist without states at all, forming stateless nations. Nationalism emerges when a national group claims the right to self-determination, the right to govern itself. Nationalism has been a powerful force in world politics, driving independence movements, shaping state formation, and fueling conflict. It can be inclusive and it can be emancipatory, but it can also be exclusionary and aggressive, especially when tied to ethnic or religious identities. Finally, our textbook chapter raises an important question. What is the future of the state? Some argue that states remain as powerful as ever. They still control militaries, borders, taxation, and law. Recent events, from pandemic response to surveillance technologies that maybe we've read about in the news, demonstrate how deeply states can reach into society. Others argue that globalization, migration, international cooperation, and economic interdependence have weakened states. According to this view, authority is increasingly dispersed upward to international institutions and downward to local actors. A third perspective suggests that states are not declining so much as changing form. They continue to matter, but they operate in new environments and face new constraints. Rather than disappearing, the state is adapting. Understanding states and nations is fundamental and foundational for comparative politics. It helps us explain why political systems differ, why conflicts emerge, and why government governance succeeds in some contexts and fails in others. The state remains central, not because it is perfect or it is permanent, but because it continues to structure everyday political life across the globe. Thank you.